We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Hello to everyone. My name is Laurent Borzillo. I am postdoctoral researcher who is in charge of the implication of the strategic network and co-editor that you were able to maybe look at certain publications earlier. I've done research on transatlantic infrastructure and defense, and it's with great pleasure that I accepted to moderate the last panel today, which is dedicated to strategic coherence of Canada. Before presenting our panelists that have accepted to take part in this panel, I would like to congratulate the team of Queens for the quality of this colloquium. The objective of the panel is to look at how Canada could have a strategic foreign policy and protect their national interests. They are often deciding between divergent allies, and they are in competition with big powers. And how do we do this in a coherent manner to defend and define national interests in line with certain initiatives or projects of allies, and the budget for their implementation, and the challenge that will be taken on by our panel of experts? So I will let them present them to you. So Philippe Beaulieu, who is the co-founder and president of Archipel La Conception, who wants to show off the experience of defenses with new innovation for research and education. Professor in the Armed Forces College, who received the Marie Curie grant. And his research is mainly on defense policy and the security of Israel, United States, and Canada. Chantal Lavallée is assistant professor in the Center of Governance and Security in Saint-Jean. She is senior researcher in Oslo, and also works in Paris University. She also received a postdoctoral grant, Marie Curie, for his research on the question of drones and the European Commission for the University of Brussels about the Dutch language. And her research and publication is on this subject and is mainly on cybersecurity and defense and emerging technologies. Jonathan Paquin, who joined us virtually, he was not able to come, but we are proud to have him on the panel. He is professor at political science at University of Laval, and he is right now in Charleston. He studies strategies, and his work is on international relations and foreign policy in terms of security, especially that of Canada and the United States. He got his doctorate at McGill University in political science, and he was also at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Finally, Gordon Venner is a high official, and he was ambassador of Canada in Iran, and was in charge of many offices. And he worked in Maghreb and Afghanistan, and the deputy minister to the Minister of National Defense. I'll now leave the floor to Philippe Beaulieu. Thank you, Laurent, for this presentation, and thank you for the invitation to the from the network. It's great to have included me on this panel. I listened to Justin Massy at the beginning and talking about threats to the government. I think if we really believe to the threats version, maybe we should also not be scared of risks and take risks sometimes. So what I will do in my presentation is maybe give a third perspective to the strategy in Canada. It's not on paper yet, so maybe your reactions will we'll put it on paper eventually. So maybe to develop a little bit more on the presentation, to put you into context, at the College of Armed Forces, I'm in charge of teaching the formulation of the strategy for national defense to the colonels and to the senior civil servants, and especially for the second semester. And we bring students and we make them conscious of the strategy, and we expose them to new methods. We talked about the future earlier, the importance of creating a habit of thinking of the future. And so we try to create new strategic concepts to bring the Canada into the 21st century. And it's very stimulating and great to be in the company of the youth. And with General David Aboud, we have a project to start to think of what kind of process of correlation we could have with regards to national defense. And it's a project that is mobilizing academics and senior military officers. So it's quite interesting. And of course, we do comparisons with the Scandinavian countries and other major and small world powers. So I'm coming to my main point. So if we look into the debate about strategic coherence, there is one angle which is consensual, which is quite common, is that practitioners are often frustrated by a lack of strategy and a lack of national defense strategy. We can think of this network, and I think there is a consensus, especially with regards to transparency. We can think of the report of the SAP. We can also think of the report of the CEGE, the Center on International Governance and Innovation, which also wants a new strategy, and many different students that want a new strategy. In the other camp, we have people like my colleague Adam Chapnick, who will say the status quo is all right. The strategy in Canada is very ad hoc. There's a lot of flexibility. And why put in the effort to create this paper with everything that it can bring in terms of controversy for a paper that probably won't be useful? So that's the other extreme. And in my reflection, I thought there might be a third position. Maybe Canada is a little bit more coherent than we think if we think of a different way of seeing the strategy. And I'm very inspired and influenced by the work of Robert Shaw and Robin Holt, maybe because I took too much time in Copenhagen with Robert. But all this to say, they wrote the book Strategy Without Design, the strategic efficacy of indirect action. And they talk about two big paradigms for strategy. The first one is the one which is dominant. It's to talk about buildings or construction. So we have an environment. We want to try to achieve something in this environment. We want to get something in the environment. We will mobilize all the means we have to get this. So if we think, for example, of NATO, we want to get a stability post-Second World War and build this organization with a lot of effort. And the second paradigm is that they encourage to take into consideration is the dwelling education. So we can think of education, innovation, and renovation. So how can we reinforce our institutions or our country as a whole to be able to achieve certain opportunities? So rather than forcing things on the environment, we will try to go where we have the environment so that we can give a sort of momentum. So it's a paradigm that concentrates a lot more on increasing our chances in the environment rather than really push something from a very, very directly. And we can think of one of the examples is the immigration strategy in Canada. So what we do we go get international talent, and we already have a very high power of attraction, rather than doing something completely new. And I know I'm coming to the end of my time, but if we look at the exterior foreign policy with Trudeau, it's a lot more of a paradigm invitation than construction. So if we think of all the management of relations with the United States under Trump, it's very gray, but we try to avoid every conflict. We try to keep under the radar. So why put in effort where we risk to not get anything in return? We can focus on international commerce to get a certain advantage. But unfortunately for us, we are all passionate about defense and security, but it's not a priority in a paradigm, especially in the circumstances that we're living in right now. So we can do better if we recognize and explicitly realize that it's the paradigm that we're using, the paradigm of dwelling. We can do a lot more, because we see what will happen with climate change. Canada will become a country that will attract many people to minimize the dangers of this. We can think right now about systemically about Ukraine, the problem of food security, energy problems with minerals, or with microprocessors. It's all things where we are already dominant. We can do a lot here without having to intervene. And just that agrees with the paradigm of habitation, of dwelling. I will stop there to allow discussion, but if we play with our paradigms, it allows us to have a different perspective if Canada is this incoherent strategically. Thank you. Thank you very much for these first couple perspectives. So I will now leave the floor to Jonathan Paquin to continue.
Thank you, Laurent. Thank you to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be with you, even if I'm not physically in the room. At least via Zoom, I can participate in this great discussion. And I must say that the discussions that you had since the beginning of the day were pretty challenging and inspiring. So thanks to all of you for the different panels that we've had since the beginning of the day.
Thank you also to Philippe, Chantal, and Gordon. I would really like to talk with you after the panel. Well, what we could talk about during the panel, but I fear that it's for another moment. Finally, before speaking of coherence of our foreign policy and defense, I think it's important maybe to have a diagnostic, which was already given before, but I would like to maybe summarize it and present to you my diagnostic, which is maybe not the one that you have. It's based on a double something that I realized. So Canada faces a double problem of coherence. The first problem, we already know it. We've been speaking about it for about 25 years. It's the one about our role and our status on the international scene. Since the events that happened in 1990 and 1991, I don't think Canada really ever came back. And for a certain time, we've been trying to find ourselves on the international scene. We've been disoriented. And we are in part disoriented because we don't have a clear idea of what we did during the Clear War. It's maybe romanticized a little bit, but as you know, Canada was able to do a lot of things in a different context. And this disorientation that we observe, it is certainly, there's a certain amount of symptoms and ones that we can identify, which is that there's a lack of communication between foreign policy, the foreign policy narrative, so what we want to be on the international scene, and the reality in the field. And that's also about the perception that the other players have of Canada. There's really a lack of correspondence communication, and that's for the last decade at least. The second symptom that I see that is still in line with the first problem of coherence this lack of Canada is the emergence of a struggle, of a partisan struggle especially in the last 15 years, between two visions of our foreign policy. Of course, they've always been present. At the time of the Cold War, they were there, and during the Suez Canal problem, there was also that. But over at least the last 15 years, there's been this partisan struggle for the narrative, and it really picked up. There are those that we call the liberal internationalists, and the Trudeau government is inspired by this vision of things. And on the other side, there's the perspective that we could maybe call valorant conservatism, which questions this consensus that is rather old-fashioned of what Canada should do. So those are two symptoms that we've seen over the last couple of years. It wasn't that bad to see that there was these symptoms until recently. It wasn't that bad because it didn't really have strong consequences. The United States were the number one force in terms of military. There was a leadership from the United States, not all the time, but most time. So international relations were, up to a certain point, well scripted. We knew approximately where the United States were going to go. We were able to see this ahead of time. And the consensus of American foreign policy was not really questioned, or very little questioned, in the United States. Things changed recently, and this sort of disorientation of foreign policy suddenly is creating important headaches for us. Why? Because we don't know where the United States are going anymore. And because we are seeing a resurgence of traditional conflicts. There's a competition between big world powers. In the space of a couple of years, there are hot regions that are on your radar, and maybe we should do something. So that's the first coherence problem that we can see. And it has many consequences. The second problem of coherence is, I talked about it, it's the discontinuity in defense politics of certain of our closest allies, and especially and inevitably the United States. We are watching, as you know, a unipartisanship, which is not that recent. I will remind you what happened in the end of the 1990s. What happened during a scandal, and before that in the 80s rather. So this bipartisanship is more and more worrisome and more distinct. And American politics are not really ready to face these ideas. And it's not, we didn't think it would be that dysfunctional. So we are faced with a Congress which is now almost paralyzed and certainly very dysfunctional. The American presidents more and more govern with presidential decrees. So there have always been some in the history of the United States. But what we are observing right now is that there is a disparity between ideologies. Decrees are used to unknit certain of the politics. So President Trump could invalidate decisions that were taken by his predecessor. So Biden is doing the same thing with regard to the Trump administration on major issues, on major political orientations, and on planetary issues as well. So we are the northern neighbors, and we are the only real neighbor. Of course, there's Russia, but we are the main neighbor of the United States, and we don't really know where to turn. And it's problematic because we are trying to find ourselves, and that's been going on for a while. So there's really we can't really see what's going on in the United States. Often we would only touch at the question, and it is important to look at what's going on in the United States. And we can't be too pessimistic, obviously, with our analysis of the events, but it's important to look with optimism that we are living in a better world over the next couple of years. And also, we need to be responsible of what's going on. And the worst thing is, in link with the coherence of foreign policy, it's that we could witness the slowdown of democracy in this country. I think it's a possibility. And so we need to take our dispositions. And so that's the second element that creates a lot of incoherence, because once again, we don't know where to turn to. And with the diagnostics, I've been hearing it since the beginning of the day. Canada is worried by their status and by its reputation, to the point that it can be paralyzing. And I think Theo McCaughton looked at it as well. We need to look at the problem from another standpoint. So rather than concentrating on our status and being on the Security Council without really knowing what we want to do, we would rather go back to the fundamental interests in Canada, to be targeted and circumscribed and not aim in all directions or chase all the sheep at the same time. I think we should be much more circumscribed and precise in our way of attacking this issue. And if we do things well, maybe the consequences will be that we have a better status or a better reputation. And that would be great. But we need to look at this question on the side of interests, what are our values, our material interests, and then we will look at what will be the consequences. Quickly, because I know time, I'm missing time. A couple ideas and solutions. I don't have the truth or the solution. I'm just doing my part. But if I look at them in the opposite order, is there a little bit of time? I could come back as well, because, yeah, so that would be maybe better. But yes, thank you. I will now go to Chantal Lavallée. Thank you, Laurent, for the introduction. And Justin and Stephanie for the invitation. I'm happy to be with you today. You've done excellent work in terms of communication. So I want to talk about the context of my introductory remarks that I titled "The Reliance on European Defense in the War of Ukraine. What is the impact for Canada in terms of opportunities?" So I've listened to everything that was said so far. I took notes to back up my views. So if we come back to what Justin said this morning, if we look at the priorities of Canada, one of them is having in mind international cybersecurity. We talk about cooperation on a regional level. And so to see what's going on in Europe and the changes, they too have indicators on the repositioning and in the context right now. So what we see with the war in Ukraine is obviously a European defense, and there are many factors already in the last couple of years that had allowed the European Union to reinforce their defense, and the Brexit as well. So we take away a barrier that minimized efforts in terms of defense. We talked about President Trump this morning. We talked about it in terms of ability to see events. So we also add on the retreat of forces in Afghanistan. Europeans realize that obviously they are not implicated in these strategic choices. So then we start the debate on strategic autonomy of the European Union. So everything is in the presentation of the students, which reminds us that there are sometimes shocking situations. And the European Union, even with the Biden administration, we don't understand very well what's going on in the tripartite relations in the context of the war in Ukraine. And we see that we will start defending with many new cooperations that are being created. But there is a willingness to defend, and we talked about Baltic countries, and also in Sweden and Finland we see voluntary military service, and in Sweden since 2010 already the conscription for men and women. So we are trying to better prepare the population to take up arms and to defend themselves. And a couple of examples here that will feed the discussion to see how Canada will position themselves. We have in mind Sweden and Finland, who signed the protocols and NATO protocols in Madrid. So we will probably go from 21 to 22 NATO states, and eventually 32. So it's a dynamic change. So two historically neutral countries that are joining NATO, and who had basically retreated from all types of military interventions. And on the 1st June, the population supported that, and the Danish government is also involved in European defense. And Denmark wants to participate in maneuvers. And obviously there's also Germany, who has done a first major declaration since the Second World War, and will increase their GDP that they spend on defense. And Germany will be the country with the biggest military budget. But what analysts are saying as well, we need to be careful, because delays are so important that it will take time for this to show. But we already talked about military engagement this morning of the United States, or in the second panel, we talked about arms in Ukraine. So Germany's repositioning also for defense. In the European scale, I will go over it quickly, but there are many initiatives. And I will start by one of the intergovernmental instruments that allows us to look at the war in Ukraine. And so right now we see $2.5 billion worth of arms, of weapons that are being sent to Ukraine. And then there's also the willingness to reinforce European capabilities. And so quickly, since the beginning of the intervention in Ukraine, there's the French presidency, so we see that we need to reinforce European capacities. And timing wants it that there's a new strategy, a new compass, strategic compass, that says here are the threats, here are our means, and we propose many different initiatives. And some of them are supported by the European Commission, who is transforming this European defense that is directed by states. And the European Union is also able to be an actor in the domain in the area of defense. Which brings me to my last point before speaking of implication for Canada, is to have in mind the transatlantic context. Because if we have the compass, we also know with NATO we have new strategic concept, the first one since 2010. And what's interesting is in both cases, for NATO, it's quite new. So we mentioned obviously China, the Russian threat also to the European Union, and also the risks in terms of this Chinese positioning, especially in terms of critical infrastructure. And also in terms of change of value. And so there's also an area about emerging technologies. And what's coming out clearly is strategic partnerships of the European Union need to be consolidated and serve as a means to face threats. So there's a technological sector that we talked a little bit about today, but we need to take this into account because many initiatives, we want to be able to coordinate with the initiatives of NATO. And as you know, NATO at the Brussels summit had announced an accelerator of defense innovation, the Diana that you may have heard about. Why do I talk about Diana? Because Canada, as you know, announced that they will have the North American strategy, whereas Britain will work with Europe. So there are many opportunities, and I may take 2 minutes and we can discuss it more in depth. What does it mean for Canada in terms of a challenge? So when Germany reaches their 2% of military investment, we can talk about 2% of Canada to also achieve their 2%, because it's difficult if Germany manages to reach their goal. The margin of error in Canada is always at 1.7, can't be explained very well. So in terms of a challenge, yes, Canada can be a strategic partner, but we see with NATO, they want to reinforce this partnership between the European Union and NATO. And for Canada, there is a lot of opportunities, new opportunities in terms of engagement. I could come back to it in the questions for the panel. What I wanted to mention also, maybe just to say, we talked a lot about it. It's an element. We talked about transparency in terms of defense and in terms of communication, and that is something that Canada could benefit from. There's a willingness to have a narrative on one side, and also we talked about earlier we need to explain in terms of education how this defense is shaped. Even in sectors of defense in the European Union, there are accompanying documents that are part of this. What is the governance? What is the budget? How much was invested? And I think that's also a reference that could inspire Canada. So I will stop there. Thank you very much, Chantal. So to finish, I would go to Gordon. Thank you. Maybe after the others, I will be the only one to speak in English today.
But I'll just begin by saying that I'm going to take a different approach to this, a little bit more of a practitioner's approach to ensuring coherence. And in the process, I also want to try and link some of the conversation back to the previous panel. I think Professor McLaughlin said that he was going to foreshadow what came forward at this panel. So I will try and return the favor by linking it back to some of the comments you heard earlier. And as a practitioner, I'm just going to say that if you're going to achieve strategic coherence in this policy field, then the first challenge up is internal coherence within the government. So you're talking about achieving coherence across foreign policy, defense policy, aid and development policy, key domestic policies like national security, law enforcement, and in this day and age, just about anything else. And after a couple of years of pandemics, you can't really discuss international affairs without discussing health policy. And one of the challenges of that is that when you start discussing areas like health policy, then you have to get into coherence of foreign policy with the provincial policies, because how do you have coherent foreign policy when it starts straddling federal provincial jurisdictions? And I mean, just as an aside there, I started my career working on the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. There's a foreign policy agreement. You're negotiating a treaty with the United States. One of the first issues the United States put on the table was listing practices in alcoholic beverage retail spots. And the federal government negotiators jumped into that issue with both feet, and they were well advanced before somebody actually asked the question, what if we negotiate stuff and the provinces just don't implement it? Right? There's no way to make the provinces implement it. What if we just do it and it doesn't happen? So suddenly there's a huge coordination challenge there in terms of coherence. How do you actually make federal and provincial work on the same page? I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too far, but that sort of experience required the establishment of quite an ad hoc mechanism to actually make sure that the country could have a meaningful international negotiation. So when you're trying to bring together all of these different policy areas and ensure that you're all speaking from the same, the same song sheet there, the holy grail, what you're always looking for is that golden thread that runs through all the policy areas, the common theme that allows you to link all sorts of disparate issues together and give you a common way of proceeding. And the ideal for this is to have the government commit itself to it in some way that allows you to put forward policies that the government in effect has already committed itself to in principle. Ideal solution would be a reference in a throne speech. So if you've got a reference in the throne speech somewhere that says we're committed to this principle, well, then it doesn't matter so long as you can link your initiative, whether it's with respect to development or defense or foreign policy or any matter of domestic policy, you can say, this is in the throne speech. You've already committed yourself to the principle. This is just how the principle gets applied in this particular instance. And then you've got the beginnings of coherence. And if it isn't a throne speech, maybe it's a budget speech, but you've got to have some way of getting everybody on the same page. Rennie will remember we came close to this during the long period of we were in Afghanistan. We used to talk about the 3 Ds: defense, development, and diplomacy. And the 3 Ds were a great way of ensuring that you didn't have different parts of the federal government competing with each other in ways that were counterproductive. So the 3 Ds approach said, you can't actually have development in Afghanistan if you don't have a secure environment in which to develop the development programming. Therefore, you have to have a sufficient amount of defense investment and capacity in the country in order to get the security that you need to deliver the development programming. That was the beginnings of coherence, because all of a sudden, the defense establishment and the development establishment weren't competing with one another for resources to say, okay, we think the money should go over here instead of over there. They were actually recognizing that they were codependent, that if one of them didn't go ahead, the other one couldn't go ahead either. And you had, I think what somebody referred to earlier today as a forcing mechanism, I think it was Kerry, a forcing mechanism that actually required people to come to the table and get on the same page. So, and I'm going to link this in a second to how we behave internationally. But in a new era of superpower competition, it is reasonable to expect that some of the elements of Canadian foreign policy from the last great period of superpower competition are going to resurface as critical to our foreign policy practices. The same forces which brought those elements to the fore during the Cold War are likely to come up again. And one of those elements will be the need to support multilateral institutions and have recourse to multilateral dispute settlement. So supporting multilateralism per se is an end, and is an end we need to pursue. And I want to be a little bit careful here because Professor McLaughlin made a good point earlier when he said we got to make certain that we're not confusing the means and the end here. It's not important just to be influential. Correct me if I got you wrong, Professor. It's important not to be influential if we don't know why we want to be influential. What is it we're actually trying to achieve with that influence? The same can be said about multilateralism. It's great to be a multilateralist, but what do you want the multilateral institutions that you're working with or the multilateral approach that you're taking, what do you want it to achieve? But multilateralism is a little bit different because it is both a means and an end. It's a means, but 9 times out of 10, the solutions that come out of a multilateral process are going to be in our best interests. That's just inherent in being a middle power. So it is an end to actually support multilateralism and to try and make multilateralism work. So we're a country, and I don't want to go back too far into basics here, but we're a country that's always going to need recourse to multilateral solutions because we don't have the levers that some bigger countries do to actually be influential on the world stage. If we were influential with China, the two Michaels wouldn't have been in jail for so long. If we were influential with the United States, key pipelines would actually get built. If we were influential with Russia, we would use that influence to prevent it from invading Ukraine. We're not. We're not really very influential, and unless we work in a multilateral way, then we're not going to accomplish. We're not going to accomplish much. That's just an enduring truth of our status as a middle power. Fortunately, we have a legacy of cooperation in multilateral organizations that we can reinvigorate. We are at home in NATO, in NORAD, in the G7, in the Five Eyes, in the G20, the OECD, APEC, the WTO, NAFTA, the CPTPP. I could keep going on. If there's a group out of there with initials, we're a part of it. And we forget sometimes how well connected we are and how much of an advantage it is for us to be party to so many different groups and to be able to sort of fertilize ideas among those groups. I spent a couple of years working simultaneously as the G8 sous Sherpa for Canada and as the APEC senior official. And I was amazed how often I could take ideas from one fora and then transport them into another and actually do it in a way that fostered the dialogue. I remember being in a conversation in the G7 one day where that year's chair was trying to get agreement on an environmental initiative and wasn't having a lot of luck. And partway through the conversation, I remembered that we'd done something very similar in APEC, and it had been approved at the previous APEC summit. And I was able to go to the chair and say, okay, so this thing isn't exactly what you want, but it's pretty close. And Canada's a member of APEC, Japan's a member of APEC, Russia's a member of APEC, the United States is a member of APEC. That's 4 of the G7 right there. So you just get the others to sign on and you've got an instant deliverable. So multilateralism can work in our interests. And it can be that forcing mechanism that helps you to ensure some kind of coherence across the government policy fields. It is true, though, that multilateralism only works for us if multilateralism itself is, thank you, I got 1 minute. Multilateralism itself is actually working. It is hard to think of any great recent accomplishments of the World Trade Organization. How many people here could tell me how APEC has improved our lives over the last 20 years? How effective have all of the economic sanctions that have multilaterally been applied to Russia actually been in changing Russian behavior over the last few months? Right? Multilateralism doesn't always work. So the challenge, one of the great challenges for us, being well positioned to do it, is to actually make multilateralism more effective. And where do you start? I would suggest, and I'll leave this for the question period, but the place to start is at the United Nations, which is probably the most fundamental multilateral institution of them all. So maybe we can come back to that later.
Thank you very much. Thank you for these first interventions that are quite interesting. Especially, I appreciated internal coherence. But before looking at this, it will allow us to complete the propositions of Jonathan and even ask the question to the 4 panelists on what could we do. We talked about strategic coherence and what should we prioritize in terms of interests. I'd like to come back on this aspect and maybe also if we look at the manner in which Canada could take part in certain initiatives, and if we compare with what's going on in Europe right now, we are not in a perspective of our allies are doing this, so we should be with them, but how could Canada's allies be used to help? We looked at subjects such as Arctic or continental defense, and in the Indo-Pacific. So I will leave the floor to Philippe Beaulieu, and after that, we will go to Jonathan. If I stay aligned with what I wanted to say is, if there's something with a paradigm of habitation, it's how can it be translated? It can be translated in many ways, but what the government is doing right now with their policy of growth is to find out why is there growth. We don't know, but everything is put in place to favorize this. We should have a policy or strategy that would be aligned with our identity and what we want to become as well as a people. So there can't just be growth, but it must go in line with our identity as well, as Carrie said earlier. But with diversity and tolerance, how can we align with this and not just on autonomy? Jonathan? Yes, thank you, Laurent. I think the priority is the United States. I think I was clear enough earlier during my intervention. I think the main threat to Canadian security and to the Canadian interests as well is not China, is not Russia. It's the populism in the United States that is rampant right now, which is auto-fascist. We need to say things as they are. And American protectionism, which exists right now under Biden, which existed under Trump, and even under Obama as well. In my opinion, that's the main difficulty with which we are faced, because it's our main economic partner, it's our main ally. Our security architecture is linked, is related to the United States. So we need to think in terms of strategy. More concretely, we need to think in the short and long term. We need to learn to deal with the American beast. And no matter what the political project of the United States will look like in this 21st century, we need to get along well with the United States. We need to find a way, even if at a certain point our values are divergent or greatly divergent, we need to find a way to leverage ourselves, whether it be just for economic reasons. So more concretely, I think there are a certain amount of measures that need to be taken as of right now. And honestly, I'm stupefied to see that after 4 years of Trump and everything that it brought about for Canada, so for renegotiation of NAFTA, and after the arrival of Biden, we feel like we're all going back to our roots. So, and I said we need to be there in the field, and I think was mentioned this morning, it means being more present with the United States and with the issues, the local issues. The personnel at the embassy and at the general consulates needs to be higher, and we need much more general consulates in the United States. There are 50 states. Many of these states are predominantly Republican, and we have 12 general consulates. It's not bad, but it could be a lot better. There are certain regions in the United States that are red or purple, in which we have a presence that is very weak. So North Carolina, Missouri, and around St. Louis. Also in Arizona. We should have a much bigger presence. Or we should have honorary consulates for people that work with Canada that are not necessarily Canadian, but that know Canada and that are there to defend Canadian interests. In fact, what Canada should have is the best evaluation grid in the world. We often say that there are two countries in the world that really know American politics, Canada and Israel. I think that Canada needs to be by far the one that knows the American politics best. So we need to work to have a multi-pillar approach and to be ready to intervene to promote our interest, to explain why it's so important to collaborate with Canada in the commercial domain and with security and defense. That's extremely important. You know, for me in the United States, there's an enormous big competition. It's on the federal level and on the state level. And sometimes if we compare the role that Canada has in the United States, it's like one interest group among hundreds of interest groups. And we want to have an interest group that is more important and is very well coordinated and is very decentralized because, as you know, all politics is local. That is particularly true in the United States. Another approach that we could have, and that we've already followed in the past, would be to have a minister for Canadian-American relations or a minister for North American relationships. Europeans have secretary generals, so I don't see why we should not have our minister that would be responsible for all of the relationships between Canada and the United States, and that could intervene or make people intervene on certain issues. So the objective is to see things coming, to be able to understand the politics and to have an answer when there are problems. We have tried to catch up because we did not see the Trump administration coming, and that's completely understandable. And now we don't have any excuse anymore. We need to be on top of our game. That's the main element. In the United States, it is central. There are elements in this society, I will repeat, that are worrisome, that should worry us. And very directly, there are fees on steel, for example. That was quite important. And the renegotiation of NAFTA with offer, supply, and demand, it worried a lot of Canadians. And there could be other issues with the Ron DeSantis or Trump administration that could come out of left field. And we need to be ready for this. So I will stop there. And of course, I would have other elements that I would like to intervene on, especially on our role in Europe or our strategy or lack of an Indo-Pacific strategy. Thank you, Chantal. Maybe just to complete what Jonathan just said, we agree that we need to consider our neighbor to the south, the United States. I will also preach for this cooperation with the European Union. Why? I did a long presentation with about European defense to affirm we put aside all taboos with the war in Ukraine and said war is back to Europe. What measures are there to take? And we need a concrete narrative, because the perception is different from the Canadian perspective compared to the European one. That being said, we need to think about the impacts of this competition of world superpowers and this doubt of the Biden administration. So Europeans are worried about an ally that is maybe not as trustworthy anymore, or that we can predict anymore. And there's the idea of reinforcing autonomy, of increasing capacity. It brings me back to the point that we can only see the two sides of the Atlantic. Canada has done a similar analysis that could answer the question of Laura. What can Canada do if they can take decisions to manage the pandemic that are based on multilateralism? We had certain discussions. The European Union is a multilateral actor. So the EU and Canada, they want to affirm that Canada can be positioned on issues that where they can have more of a concrete impact. So two initiatives I wanted to mention. With the missions, already Canada has an agreement with the EU to have certain missions contribute to the European missions. And so we have a lot of contributions. We talked about the police. Canada contributed policemen, judges. And in terms of military missions, it was adopted. So there was a mission for Ukraine on European soil, obviously, where Canada could contribute. Because we talked about it this morning, it's one of the domains where Canada can shine. And there's an initiative from the United Kingdom where Canada is already participating. So there's a lot of potential to defend Canadian interests. And also, Canada can learn from these experiences of cooperation. And it's a domain where Canada could contribute more and help Europeans. And the last point is with the initiatives, the European initiatives, where some states decide to start on some issues. We talk about military mobility, which would allow the Europeans to move troops more easily. And last year, the European Union included the United States, Norway, and Canada, which would allow Canada to deploy troops in Europe as well. These are domains where we have common interests, and we could base ourselves on concrete initiatives. Thank you. I agree with certain things, but maybe I'll just add one thing.
Sometimes the greatest threats to the exercise of coherent foreign policy don't come from abroad, they come from home. It's really difficult to be a credible, articulate, spokesman for human rights and civil liberties abroad when the government of Quebec is using the notwithstanding clause to infringe on civil liberties and religious freedoms in the province of Quebec. All of your ambassadors abroad who are trying to talk in that subject area get kneecapped the minute something like that happens. And they can't even go out onto the playing field because they know that the finger is going to get pointed right back at them. So that's a problem. It is really difficult to be taken in global institutions if the leader of the opposition is running around suggesting that the World Economic Forum is some kind of global conspiracy that is going to deprive people of their democratic liberties. That's crazy. And when people hear that coming out of Canada, they think, okay, well, we can't really take you guys seriously. So sometimes the greatest threats are, look in the mirror.
Can I just continue on what Mr. Wiener just said? He talked about internal coherence, but our politicians also have a responsibility. We have excellent officials in Ottawa in the different domains of activity, and they must answer, I think, in a context of great instability, in the context like the one currently, the leaders of the parties are responsible for putting aside any kinds of discourse that is secondary, the wedge issues that are so often used by liberals and conservatives. I talk about them because they are the two parties that already formed government. And there are certain issues where we have small politics to simply make small gains or mobilize our political base. Everything that touches on tensions in the Middle East was exploited by other parties. In the Israeli Palestine conference or the conflict with Iran, there are many wedge issues that are used. Our budgets as well, up to a certain extent, are wedge issues. We are constantly going back and forth to see if we should invest more in Africa, or do we have a commercial approach or humanitarian approach. There are certainly many things we need to strengthen our ranks, and politics in Canada should stop at water's edge, or at least foreign policy. We should focus on our core business, on what is really fundamental for us, and stop with things that are not important to look at the unique side of the politics. So yes, for governments and also for politics, they have their part to make sure there's more coherence in the message. Thank you for that. Yes, I agree. Vous avez mentionné dans vos commentaires quelque chose de très similaire. Et ça m'a rappelé qu'il y a des exemples de pays où ce n'est pas le cas. Les États-Unis n'est peut-être pas le cas, mais l'Australie a une bonne histoire de défense et politique étrangère, où il y a le cas de la Groenland, où peu importe le parti au pouvoir, il y aura une entente sur la base. Donc, les Australiens ont fait une politique de défense. Il y avait beaucoup de succès avec la réception. Il y a eu une élection, ils ont changé de gouvernement, mais le nouveau gouvernement a regardé les politiques et s'est dit qu'il ne va pas changer les politiques. Donc, c'est resté en place. Donc, c'est la chose dont nous ne bénéficions pas au Canada. Une compréhension partagée de notre rôle dans le monde et notre façon de faire. Et oui, je suis tout à fait d'accord, c'est un gros défi. And I would like to propose a last question on how Canada could establish a long-term strategy and commit to long-term objectives with credibility, especially considering the internal functioning to address incoherences in the strategy. And in line with that, also look at the model that was proposed, if there's a way of looking at these questions and focusing on the questions. Yes, Laurent, what I find interesting is the typology of strategic coherence. There are many ways, I think, of looking at strategic coherence. We look at the incoherence between message and actions. There's an incoherence in time. So we change ideas a lot, and internally. So I think the most important thing is with the environment, the geostrategic environment. Where is our geostrategic environment going? So there are many ways of thinking of society. In which environment are we living in, and to see where we're going, and that could give us the ingredients to develop this strategic approach, to have a consensus. We need to understand the context that we're living in, and coherence is the most important thing. The rest is less important. Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, I agree with what Philippe said. We've said it many times today. Our core business is the United States, NATO, and other organizations. I'm not too original or creative in what I say, but it's been said in the RAS report that I participated in a little bit with others. And I agree with the other orientations that were proposed that you should have been able to consult or see already. our role in Europe is in defense and security in NATO. And what Canada does with NATO, not just since 2014, but what we've been able to do in Afghanistan, which has been a considerable implication and has also gotten us much praise. It's true that the results are not, maybe didn't stay as long as we'd hoped, but people remember what Canadians did over there. And in terms of dissuasion in Eastern Europe, especially with the leadership that we are exhibiting in Latvia, that's our core business. It's outside of the American continent, but it is fundamental for Canada. And we are defending democratic principles. And that is fundamental. And in my opinion, even if we are seeing a transition of power from the from the west to the Orient, we need to keep the eyes riveted on the Atlantic. We're not supposed to put the Pacific aside completely. We need to keep commercial relations up with them. It's about the only way in which we perceive our relationship with the Great Pacific since a long time, and I'm not sure it's a good idea to invest a lot of money to do what many of our partners have done. They can do a lot better than this. Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, and some others. France, for example, is a great superpower in the Pacific. We have a tendency to forget them, but they have lots of power in there. And there's NORAD as well. That comes out a lot as well in the report of the RAS. The Arctic is fundamental. We have a know-how in Arctic that few states have. And it's up to us to play a more important role, to occupy the space and to ensure the protection of the environment, of course. And we need to occupy more space in terms of security by collaborating with First Nations, with Inuit that already are living on the territory and that know the environment a lot better than us. So I think that's important. And what was done by the Ministry of Defense is invest money on the modernization of NORAD. And on a 20-year horizon, we talk about many millions, billions of dollars. That's important for many different reasons. Because there is a threat, and development reminds us that there are players that aren't necessarily, that have the means that they could use against us. So we need to detect this, detect threats, and we can occupy the space in the Arctic and make sure that there's a coordination which is fundamental with the United States. And that is a gem that's important, especially in terms of instability right now. We want to make sure that things are calm. That's all I have to say. If the rest doesn't mean that there aren't other issues that are important, but in terms of investments that are very costly, this is one of the big ones. Chantal? Even if we didn't hear Philippe yet? So in terms of long-term strategies, I think it's important to keep a certain flexibility because we still have, with the Russian intervention in Ukraine, it's rather traditional, but it requires us to adapt rapidly so we can adapt certain things, but there are surprises. So if we speak of arms, weapons, we know that there are already orders for 10 years, but I would see it more because I'm not really for a weapons race, but it's important to have the infrastructure, to have the capability, the capacity to produce weapons. So to say, what could Canada develop to be better prepared to a particular intervention? So We could come back with the example of Germany. We realize that modernization will take a lot of time because the deficit is important. So why is Germany in this situation for history and everything? But in terms of long term, we need to be prepared. So, for example, with the analogy with COVID, if we had more vaccines, we could be better prepared. So we're now in a defense mode. So we need to redevelop infrastructure. But I would keep in mind the importance of a flexibility or a long-term strategy for better preparedness. I have nothing to add. So we will go to questions. So if there are questions in the room or otherwise in the public virtually. So we were not able to continue with the questions we received. So we were not able to pursue multilateral politics with the United States. Is multilateralism really an option in a world where we have the United States that are in a difficult approach? So is there a means in terms of multilateralism? Could it be still important and pertinent? I would ask for a short answer. I would say it's possible. And historically, there was the case where multilateralism was used to develop different strategic viewpoints, and which are quite different from the United States, with Iraq as well. So we can use multilateralism and even more in the condition of finding a world balance. So I agree with my co-panelists, it's something that we can't lose out of sight. Jonathan? Yeah, maybe multilateralism is less efficient than it already was, but it's essential, especially for a country like Canada. We all know that we need multilateralism to be able to carry our voice. If we stay in a bilateral logic, we will go under. And certain players will have much more influence and more power than us. So it's essential. Bilateralism has been a way of institutionalizing the balance of power. And we need to put emphasis on this. So we need to find a balance in a relationship with the United States that stays relatively good, despite clouds on the horizon that are very numerous. And in terms of the United Nations, we also need to continue to play a role and carry our voice to make propositions. If we leave multilateralism, we will have nothing. We will be alone with our Canadian Arctic. So it might be difficult to find consensus, but it's essential and vital for Canada. We need to continue to invest. To complete what Jonathan said, it is essential, and we see with the reaction of the Russian intervention in Ukraine, multilateralism, we saw who wasn't able to respect the rules, and we were able to impose sanctions which reinforced their unity, and we need to not be dependent on Russia. And multilateralism, we see a return to war in Europe and an answer that is more unified, because thanks to the Biden administration, maybe Trump would have acted differently, but we often heard the G7, NATO, and the United Nations, they answered well, despite the fact that Russia stays able to counteract to these sanctions. So I think that's proof that is still necessary.
So it's a really good question, but it's not quite that black and white. When the United States refuses to participate or to be bound by multilateral agreements, it's really frustrating because of the importance that they have in the international environment. But they're not the only ones that refuse to be bound sometimes by their multilateral obligations or to enter into new ones. When China joined the World Trade Organization, the idea behind that was, well, we'll get China inside the tent, and then they'll be subject to the same dispute settlement procedures that everybody else is. And China just said, well, no, actually, once they got in, they just sort of operated as if they couldn't care less about those procedures, and people didn't, take them up on it. The United States, and during the Trump administration, did a simpler thing. It simply refused to agree to the appointment of members to dispute panels, so that the WTO couldn't function. It brought it to its end. But the U.S. isn't the only country that does this. During the great fisheries crisis years ago, when we were arresting a Spanish trawler on the high seas and bringing it into port, we broke international law and violated our international agreements. The way we dealt with that was before they could take us before we actually broke the law, but knowing that we were going to, is we actually amended our agreement to be bound by the rulings of the International Court of Justice, to say we will be bound by the rulings of the International Court of Justice in every field except fisheries. Right. And then we went to the court and said, oh, yeah, but you can't rule against us because we already changed the jurisdiction of the court with respect to us, which we could do. So the United States isn't the only party that gets away with this kind of thing. Simon Reisman used to say that when he was negotiating with the US, he'd frequently ask them to do things and they would say, oh, we'd love to do that, but Congress would never allow it. And so every time they asked him to do something, Simon Reisman would say, oh, I'd love to do that, but I can't. The provinces would never allow it. And so we all have reasons that we use for why we can't do that. Every nation wants to obey international law and be bound by international precedent in so long as it serves their own interests. And then it gets challenging. So yeah, it's a bit more of a problem when the US does it, but it's not new, and we've been managing it for decades, and we'll keep managing it.
Other questions? Just, we have a little bit of time. So with coherence, there's one case. It's the relationship with China, more particularly with the perspective that goes above the questions of defense. When we take, for example, the case of China, to look at how to position ourselves with an Indo-Pacific strategy, especially in Taiwan, knowing that the United States are one of the main allies of Canada, that China is the second main commercial partner of China. So how can Canada reconciliate their economic interests with their allies? How do we deal with stronger tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, especially with Germany had to take sanctions against Moscow that could have had repercussions on their efficiency, and they were completely dependent on each other. So how do we reconciliate commercial interests and interests related to the main ally, which is the United States? I can maybe steal the thunder of Jonathan, but clearly on this question, I don't think we have the choice to align with the United States in this geostrategic question. But I will let Jonathan explain a little bit more. Go ahead. So it's a question of coherence that is important. It's a question that we've been looking at for a long time. We've done commerce business with China since a long time. In the 90s, with teams led by Jean Chrétien, we've been able to make gains in the commercial domain. And there were always issues in China that we didn't like. It's a euphemism, but we need to learn to juggle this. We need to defend our economic interests and our values. We've always done so. Maybe just one thing. It's true that China is our second economic partner, but it's far behind the United States. I mean, we have one main market. It's a market that's a lot less vigorous than 20, 30 years ago. Yes, we are making some gains in our market shares with the United States. It's diminishing each year because there are other players that are in competition with us for the American market, but our main ally remains the United States in terms of exports. So China remains way behind. So I know China will be penalized in the agro-food industry, but seeing what's happened with some European states, especially Germany, and with the Russia-Ukraine war, something tells me that Canada is taking notes and is thinking of contingency plans. So if we eventually adopted sanctions against China, because, for example, they would invade Taiwan, which would have a military blockade around the island, there would be repercussions, of course. But that's also the case with sanctions. When you give sanctions that hurt, you're demonstrating that you are resolved to apply them, and you are determined to hurt them and change their positions. So that's a possibility. I think we always are interested in being clear with our values, with our principles. We have a right to say what we think. But it also comes with consequences, and sometimes it comes with certain material damages. But we can't simply say we need to stop criticizing because of the almighty dollar, to continue the expression of Prime Minister Harper with regards to China. We have a certain amount of values. We believe in them fundamentally. That's called democracy and liberalism. So we need to continue to bring this message. We can't just rely on others to bring it. We need to bring it ourselves. Thank you. Maybe to complete Jonathan and to talk about the debate elsewhere, I think it's been a new question. I think for decades, Democrats wanted to defend their values and to also promote economic growth. Maybe I would reformulate the question. I think the awakening right now, I know that NATO for the first time includes the threat that that China is also has, and we want strategic revision, but now we want to defend economic interests rather than a strategy, and we realize that sometimes China is violating human rights, and in terms of technologies, emerging technologies rather, we're talking about Canada, but it's similar to Europeans, but NATO does it in their strategy. We want to avoid dependency on technological dependency. We can give the example of Germany, this dependency that has a lot more weight than their defensive value because the economy was on top, and now it's strategic interests that are putting states like Canada, or we talked about the 5G in Canada, and if we talk about emerging technologies, there's a risk to infrastructure that China is posing. I think there's a question here, and we haven't spoken about it a lot, but China is one of the threats in the strategic concept. But precisely in terms of emerging technologies, it completely changes. So if we talk about weight in terms of threats, that's not military, but they can be as damaging. I think the debate has changed, and it's maybe we'll stop thinking of economic interests. So the damages of the autonomy in terms of strategic domains, many countries, I think, were taken by surprise in an illusion of cooperation with China that's turning against them. So I think it's this question that will put aside economic interests in the relationship with China, and not just for Canada.
So thanks for asking a question, which allows me to link this right back to my comments at the beginning. At the end there, I said that I thought we should make multilateralism the thread that runs through the different policy fields as a way of providing coherence and bringing them all together. And I said at the very end that the place to start was with the United Nations. The Chinese have watched what's gone on in Ukraine. They understand that it is a screaming mess, and that at the moment that mess is serving nobody's interest. Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, Article 33, says that the parties to any dispute, the continuation of which is likely to endanger the maintenance of international peace and security, shall first of all seek a solution by negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies and arrangements, or other peaceful means of their own choice. If you made a list of all of the things on that list, which were ignored in the instance of Ukraine, it would be everything on that list. So the Chinese will understand that. Today's crisis is Ukraine, maybe next crisis is Taiwan, but surely the starting place in a conversation with the Chinese is to say, can we at least go back and focus on the commitments to which we are already both agreed? We're already signatories to this. Can we actually use the mechanisms that we've agreed to put in place?
Yeah, so just to piggyback off of Chantal's comments, we already see that it is not a dichotomy between values and interests in China. Already I think there's a better crisscross of interest, because we see that China is not as much of a reliable partner anymore. And I think the more things will evolve, and the more there will be devolvement of interests in Europe, in the US, and it won't be as much of a choice the way things evolve. Laurent, if I may, in 30 seconds, just to answer on this, on tensions between interests and values. And that's an interesting struggle. And I don't only want to forecast things, because things may evolve randomly, but we know that this question could be asked quite directly to Canadians if eventually we end up with a government in the South that does not embrace democratic values, a government that, let's say, has both houses and the White House, and starts to persecute migrants, or, for example, basic human rights like like reproduction rights. How would we react to this, knowing that economic links are so strong because of obvious decisions? How long could we stay silent in the name of good relations with that partner? Obviously, I think if such a situation is to arise, that would be the ultimate test for Canadians to know how far they would defend their values. We cannot obviously assume the sort of reactions Canadians would have. That is only a possibility, one among other ones, and we do not hope for it, but we should maybe start to think about that sort of catastrophic scenario, only maybe just to entertain the possibilities. I think this would be useful in that context necessary. Thank you, Jonathan, for that. We thank our panelists for all those different points on consistency, whether it is through European allies and their actions, or the importance of our neighbor to the south that is so vital, and the importance of also having that multilateralism tool. We also talked about consistency, not only more broadly, more generally, like we talked about, but also in terms of internal public policy, relating to different policy, whether it's defense, foreign policy, or humanitarian policies. I would once again like to thank our panelists, and we'll move to the presentation of a new tool from the network. Justin Massy, over to you. Okay, so we're going to continue the discussion a little bit, not about a worst case scenario, but maybe something a little bit lighter, especially before the moment you've been waiting for since this morning, the networking cocktail that will follow this conference. So we're going to take a few minutes to show you the new addition to the Network of Strategic Analysis website. It's called the Military Deployment Index, something that we just added to the website. Took a lot of time and effort, so I wanted to take the trouble to take a few minutes at the end of the conference to introduce it to you, why we created it and how it was created, why, and how it can help us better understand the military deployment of the different countries on the planet. It's called, okay, in English, it's not translated yet, it's the Military Deployment Index. What it comes down to, essentially, is to measure the military deployments of all the countries on the planet since 1990, first and foremost, and then to visualize it and to say, okay, we're able to look at it and understand where the troops are deployed, which country deploys them the most. That was the idea. Why this idea? Why? Well, because for somebody who's interested in military deployment, it's one of the most frustrating things we have is the absence of data, of reliable data, of comparable data. So in the network, we have started to do this with Canadian operations. We wanted to know where Canada has been deploying its troops for the last few years. It took a lot of time to collect this data, and then we said, why not expand it to all countries? Yes. So what we have now is about 40 countries, and eventually we're going to deploy to 193 countries that have deployed troops since 1990. So what essentially we have done is to collect data from the military balance and to collect data in PDF. It took a lot of time. We also wanted to present different dimensions. The first one is, of course, how many troops are countries sending every year and where. So that's the simplest measure. But we also wanted to develop things a little bit more to try to measure, to compare the degree of deployability, meaning for each country, which one deploys the most. We can see that the United States is the country that sends out the most, but the size of GDP is only one measure. We also wanted to know by capita. So Barbara will show you in a few seconds different sections of the website where we show you, for example, where we have enlisted troops, mounted personnel, and also a number of troops deployed per capita to see the degree of deployability. We created this index, which is a measure that Barbara will explain, to try to have comparative data to measure the degree that is per capita and in absolute terms of deployability in all the countries on the planet that have been deploying troops since the 1990s. So I'll leave it to Barbara, who has presented this as part of her master's degree at Oxford University.
Hey, hi everyone. First of all, thank you to the interpreters, because without them I wouldn't have been able to hear or understand a word of what Justin just said. So thank you for that. As he said, my name is Barbara. I'm doing my master's at the University of Oxford, and I led a small team of people who developed the index and the website itself. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to talk a little about the methodology behind the index. I'm going to walk you through the website and then share some goals for the future of this project. Yeah, so as Justin mentioned, the index has two components. There's the absolute deployment numbers and then the deployments per capita. So the first methodological decision that we had to make was to assign weight to these two, and we went with equal weight. The argument behind it is that you can have a country that's very deployable because it sends a lot of troops, like the US, for example, but a country is also considered highly deployable when the commitment that it's making with the troops is large for its size. So for example, Slovenia. Yeah, so that was the first methodological decision that we had to take. The second one was we are working with Z-scores. So that's something that allows us to standardize the data by their deviation from the mean. So that's what we did. Yeah, we added them together and scaled the results on a 0 to 100 scale. The final thing methodologically that you need to know is this is a relative measure. So like there's not one value that you can say, okay, deploying 50,000 troops corresponds to 100 on the index. So every time the country that has the highest additive Z-score value is the one that is assigned 100. So this varies year by year as well. If you want to know more about the methodology, you can click on the methodology button and just read about it. And yeah, I think we can start just going through the website. It's a little complicated because I don't have the mouse. So whoever is Brian, I think. Oh, okay. Whoever is cool. Could we please deselect all countries? Yeah, and we're left with Canada. Hopefully, I don't see. Okay. Yeah, so essentially we have 3 different views, let's say, for the whole dashboard. We have a view for a single country. You can compare 2 countries, and then you have a multi-country view. So starting with Canada, what you can see in the top half of the website now is the MDI and its evolution over time. Then if we scroll down a little, oh, okay, perfect. There's the map. So you can see the spatial distribution of Canadian troops. This is in 2021, which is the year that is selected as default. And yeah, if you, with the mouse, hover over the blue bulb, for example, the one above Latvia, yes, exactly, you can see more details about the particular deployment. Yeah, we can move down. Perfect. So then you see deployments over time. Again, it's a very straightforward, just a static figure. And then you have relative measures. So we have the troop deployments per 100,000 capita. And then we also have troops that are deployed per active personnel. And then we have the top deployment theater, which is, well, you can see that from the map as well, but sometimes it's when you have more countries, it's difficult to see. So yeah. The last part, if we go a little more down, great. All 3 graphs have to do with the distribution of troop deployments in command structures. So the first 2, you can see percentage and the actual number. With the last one, with the Summers graph, you can also see the share of operations within those command structures. And if you could please click on the UN, for example, in the inner circle, or any other item in the inner circle. Yeah, great. Okay, this is not a good example because it's just one operation, but if you can do maybe NATO or, yeah, perfect. And so now you can see what the share of specific operations is per command structure. Yeah, I think this concludes the single country view. Maybe we could add Italy now, for example. So if you go back to the filter you add, you can just type it. Okay, great. So now we enter the comparative view. As you can see, nothing changes dramatically. But oh, could we also have Canada there? Could we have both Canada and Italy? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so the MDI graph, again, it's just evolution over time, but now we can compare the 2. So you see that Italy is more deployable than Canada as per the index. When it comes to the map, again, you just see more bulbs in different colors. One feature that I didn't mention before is the toggle button that says military presence. If you could press that, it's in the top left corner of the map. Yeah, perfect. So this shows then the military presence, because we distinguish between operational deployments and presence. So you can see a little triangle appeared in Djibouti, and that's the Italian base there. Obviously, if you select more countries that have a larger presence worldwide, you'll see more of the triangles. We'll see that in a second. Yeah, maybe you can scroll down more. Again, this deployments over time is the same. For the relative metrics that we have in the top theater, you can now see the comparison. And then the last three graphs, if we go down a little more, those are aggregated. So the one in the middle is per country, but the two are aggregated per the two countries, of course. And now if we can go back to the filter and select all EU countries, for example. Yeah. Okay, great. So we see that the MDI graph now is a little dense, but we have a function where you select a part of the graph and it zooms in. I'm not sure if we can do that. When you're you can just click and drag. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and then you can do this many times and you still see what the countries are by hovering over the different trend lines. Yeah, if you go a little more down, it's again essentially the same aggregated data, but there is, if we go more down, there is another feature. If you click on the little plus sign, and yeah, for instance, there, you can see all the countries. So for visual purposes, we're just displaying the first 5, I think, that are top in the category, but you can also, of course, see this and, you know, take a screenshot, use it. Yeah, so I think that's it for the little demo. If you have any questions about it, oh, hi, yes.
Index allows for the total number of troops deployed, and it allows for the troops as a percentage of the total. I get that.
And not quite. So it's the question was about the composition of the index, essentially. So it's the absolute troop deployments crossed with per capita troop deployments. So it's relative to population.
The distance which those troops get deployed, surely a country is more deployable if it's deploying its troops halfway around the world.
You mean, okay.
Rather than just deploying troops to the countries that are all on the borders. How do you factor that in?
Yeah, that's a great piece of feedback, and we can discuss that for the next stage of the project. I think we don't factor that in right now. Would be a very simple answer to your question, but thank you so much, and we can talk about it more later. Okay, just a few things about what we're doing in the future. So as Justin said, we're expanding the pool of countries to include all countries in the world. And then we're scraping back until the 1990. So that's been done already. We're just clearing the data now because it can be a mess. So you can read more about how we're actually handling the data in the methodology section. So yeah, that's what we're doing. We also want to add the equipment that is being deployed. So primarily ships, aircraft, land equipment, perhaps. So that's that. Also adding some new comparative features, and the ultimate goal would be to train a prediction model using machine learning so that we can predict how many troops will be deployed, where and when. Yeah, so that's that. Any other questions or feedback we would really appreciate. Okay, hi, yes.
Just more curious what you did to validate the military balance data. Like, did you cross-check with other data sources on military?
To validate?
Yeah.
No, so that's something that we discuss in the methodology as well. It's practically infeasible to check alternative sources. You know, that would mean probably national governments or you know, newspaper sources or whatever. But our goal, I mean, the data is imperfect, and there's a lot of things that we had to clear manually. But it's still, I think, the trade-off between that and having one source that allows for like cross-country comparisons and studies would outweigh that. But no, absolutely, you're right. And it is complicated sometimes. For example, countries, they report the maximum number of troops that were allowed to be deployed rather than the actual number that they're deploying. Like, for example, I don't know, Slovakia, the parliament said yes to 42 troops to the NATO mission in Iraq, but they actually only deploy like 12. So, and you have difference in what governments actually report to the IISS, but that's something that's out of our control. Yeah. Any other questions or feedback? Yeah, I'll be around, so you can tell me then in person as well. Okay. All right.
Not quite done yet, but almost. I did my introductory remarks in French, so I'll do the closing in English. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. It was a wonderful, very rich day of discussions and analysis, frankly. And I think we've made a lot of progress since last year. We had set out to talk about strategic coherence, and we had outlined several pathways in the report, design over default, which I'm thrilled with the feedback we received. And I think it also clarifies for us, speaking of strategic clarity, the work that still needs to do ahead in terms of the how. You know, there's the what and the how, the intricacy of, let's say, organizing cyclical defense reviews, right, with all the political and bureaucratic constraints that entails, for instance, is the other side of the coin. So while we had a lot of fun consulting with our colleagues and other experts who were willing to take part in the consultations, and it was great to discuss the report, now I think we have a series of trade-offs to grapple with, you know. For instance, with greater transparency, which we advocated for in the report, comes operational security issues, right? So those sub-questions and sub-problems and sub-puzzles for us will lay the groundwork for the work that we do ahead as a puzzle. And that's what we love about this network, is the co-development of research questions and puzzles rather than us coming up with the questions isolated in our ivory towers. I think this is the beauty of the Minds Network and why it's so beneficial for us as a common security and defense community, is that sharing of the knowledge, sharing of the data, and then coming up together with the most important questions that we need to tackle together. Before I turn it over to Justin for very quick words, and to finish off before we go to our reception and get to mingle, I thanked our team at the beginning of the day. Now I'm going to thank the sponsors and the funding that all comes together to provide the food, the space, and of course the drinks. So the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, not responsible for the drinks, I want to make that clear, but certainly responsible for a lot of the other aspects. Cerium at Université de Montréal, Canis at the University of Calgary, SIPS at the University of Ottawa, CDSM at Carleton, UQAM. We can thank UQAM for the drinks and the reception, and of course, Minds, the mobilizing insights in defense and security, the program within the Department of National Defense that provides funding for small projects, and networks like ours, and several other networks are represented throughout this conference. Special shout out as well to our team at the Center for International Defense Policy at Queen's University. I didn't mention Maureen this morning, but Maureen Bartram oversees a lot of this from our home base in Kingston. So that's all I have to say. I also have a special message about the tickets, very important drink tickets. If you didn't get a blue ticket like this for a drink, please go and see Emile. He'll be very popular. I think we'll have more than one ticket too as well, because we've had a few dropouts, but I look forward to exchanging with you. Right, again, turn to your left as you exit the room for the reception. It's where the lunch was on display. So we'll be joining over there very shortly. Just there.
Just to conclude, I would like to thank you all for contributing to today's event, but also for contributing to texts, to participate online, on site. Thanks to you, we can have, our organization is alive. We are applying for a renewal for 3 years, and we do hope so that every year we can organize a conference in Ottawa for 2014, 25, 26, and we hope that the Department of Defense hears us loud and clear. So thank you all for participating, and I can't wait to see you all. Thank you and goodbye.